You've heard me say that we can build parallel systems that put people before profit, but that phrase can mean very different things depending on how you interpret it. Some people think it means isolated communities trying to leave society. Others think it simply means starting a few cooperatives, but neither of those really captures what I mean. So in this video, I want to slow down and clarify something properly. What parallel systems actually are, what they're not, and why they matter. Because once you understand this properly, a lot of the conversations around this movement will start to make more sense. Most people picture parallel systems in completely the wrong way, and that misunderstanding makes the whole idea seem completely unworkable. The word parallel causes a lot of confusion because when people hear the phrase parallel systems, they often imagine a completely separate society or a fully independent civilization somewhere outside of the existing economy. But historically, that's rarely how lasting alternatives develop. Parallel systems don't leave society. A parallel system is another set of institutions operating in the same environment, but organized differently. They exist in the same economy. They interact with the same society. They're affected by the same conditions. So they're not isolated or separate from the world around them. They're structured differently while still operating alongside the dominant system. This distinction is important because some communities do try to create isolated systems. These are projects that exist entirely outside the wider economy. And there's nothing wrong with that intention, but in a deeply interconnected world, it's extremely difficult. Even communities trying to live independently still rely on things like tools and materials produced elsewhere, water, transport or energy, and legal recognition of land and property. So complete separation is rarely realistic in the long term. Parallel systems start from a different assumption. They recognize that societies are already deeply interconnected. Most people already live within complex infrastructure, cities, housing systems, workplaces, and supply chains. It's not realistic for millions of people to withdraw from that system entirely. So practical and long-lasting alternatives usually have to function where people already live. Another advantage of parallel systems is that people aren't forced into one structure or another. Individuals and organizations can move between them depending on what works best. So at this point, we've clarified two things. Parallel systems are not isolated communities trying to leave society. They're institutions that can operate alongside the existing system while following different rules. But there's another misunderstanding that people often make at this stage. They assume that parallel systems means starting a few alternative organizations, for example, worker-owned businesses, consumer-owned businesses, or community-owned entities. Those are parallel organizations, not parallel systems. A parallel system only begins to appear when multiple institutions start covering different functions of society. Things like enterprise, finance, education, research, and social support. When those institutions start to reinforce each other, you start to see something behaving more like a system rather than just isolated projects. Two well-known examples of parallel systems that I've shared with you are Mondragón in the Basque region of Spain and the cooperative economy of Emilia-Romagna in Italy. Mondragón began with worker cooperatives, but eventually developed a much broader ecosystem of supporting institutions, things like enterprises, cooperative finance, education institutions, research and development, and social support systems. Those institutions reinforced each other. That's what pushed it beyond just individual organizations and closer to a system. The Italian region of Emilia-Romagna, they developed a dense ecosystem of cooperative institutions. worker cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, and social cooperatives, networks that help firms share services and compete globally, finance and support organizations, training and research organizations, federations that are organized by sector that help coordinate strategy. These firms still operate fully within the Italian and global economy, but the institutional ecosystem functions very differently to conventional corporations. When we talk about building alternative systems, a common objection I usually get is something along the lines of, well, if these alternatives start to succeed, the system will just shut them down. But when you look at history, the pattern is usually more nuanced. What tends to happen is a sequence. So small initiatives are mostly ignored. As they grow, they begin to interact with existing institutions. And once they become economically important, shutting them down often becomes difficult. Because once you have institutions creating jobs, stabilizing communities, or solving real problems, shutting them down would mean damaging parts of the wider economy. At that point, you have livelihoods depending on them, communities benefiting from them, and local economies relying on them. So instead of being destroyed, what tends to happen is that they're adapted, regulated, and sometimes eventually supported. Another pattern you can see in examples like Mondragón and to some extent Emilia-Romagna is that pressure doesn't always destroy alternative systems. In many cases, it forces them to adapt and develop their own infrastructure. Early on in Mondragón, traditional banks didn't understand or support cooperative enterprises. So instead of abandoning the idea, the movement created its own financial institution to fund cooperative development. Something similar happened with social welfare as well, because co-op members were not entitled to parts of the state's social security system. So eventually Mondragón created its own welfare institution as well. These examples show the same pattern. Constraints inside the dominant system often become the trigger for institutional innovation. In other words, pressure often becomes the reason these systems evolve and grow stronger. Alternative systems matter because they create leverage. When one economic structure provides most of the jobs, investment, infrastructure, it naturally limits the range of options that feel possible. But when alternative ecosystems exist, even smaller ones, it changes the range of options available. A strong alternative ecosystem can create alternative employment opportunities, alternative sources of finance, different ownership models, different ways organizations can be structured, and sometimes even independent welfare institutions. At that point, they begin to change the range of choices available in society. And that's really what leverage means in structural terms. When there's only one institutional system providing the majority of jobs, investment, and infrastructure, walking away from it isn't a realistic option. But when alternative ecosystems exist, individuals, communities, and organizations have somewhere else to go. And the ability to walk away is where the real leverage comes from. This isn't about replacing one system with another. It's about diversifying institutional power.